This week in archaeology news, how Arctic ice cores tell us Roman IQs dropped, a new mega-fortress in Georgia, a Russian shipwreck in Iran, a Venom-curing doctor's tomb in Egypt, and why was a red painted dog's penis bone down a Roman shaft. I'm Dr. Marshall Schertz. Today is January 12th, 2025, and this is Archaeolist. First, a couple big news stories coming out of Saqqara in Egypt. Saqqara is famous for being the site of the Pyramid of Djoser, the so-called Step Pyramid, considered to be the first pyramid in Egyptian history. But the Saqqara necropolis is far more than that. Egyptian history classes talk about the mastaba brick tombs that looked like giant benches that led to the creation of the Step Pyramid, effectively many mastabas stacked on top of each other. But for many centuries later, pharaohs put their pyramids and burial complexes elsewhere in Saqqara. The last pyramids were built at Saqqara at the end of the Old Kingdom, but new research from a joint Egyptian-Japanese team now shows that not only was the necropolis used during the New Kingdom, many centuries later, but the area of the necropolis extends much further east and north than they previously thought. The archaeologists from Kanazawa University excavated 4 Old Kingdom mastaba tombs from the 2nd and 3rd dynasty. These mastaba had a typical but impressive Egyptian artifacts, including an alabaster dish and a cylindrical vessel. But importantly, they discovered 2 rock-cut tombs from the 18th dynasty, part of the New Kingdom. It now appears that the New Kingdom burials started up in Saqqara again after the Egyptians kicked the Hyksos foreigners out of Egypt and moved their capital back to Memphis, nearby. These rock-cut tombs were cut into the bedrock and had limestone to seal the shaft. These discoveries come a year after the same team had opened up a series of Greco-Roman catacombs, also at Saqqara, giving a hint about the vast number of tombs at that site. Another research team that is working in southern Saqqara, the Mission Archéologique Franco-Suisse de Saqqara, excavated an Old Kingdom tomb with a special occupant. Next to the pyramid of King Pepi II was the tomb of his chief palace physician, Teti Nebfu. Pepi II was one of the last notable Old Kingdom pharaohs, but also ruled for an extraordinarily long time. Even though he's recorded as taking the throne at 6 years old, he may have ruled for as long as 94 years. Or, that's what the chronologies and the king lists say. Regardless, he lived quite a long time. Pepi II's physician's tomb is a major discovery, though. On the walls and the sarcophagus of the tomb, it lists Teti Nebfu's many titles. Much like doctors today, he had a whole list of titles after his name. In addition to being chief palace physician, he was chief dentist, he was director of medicinal plants, basically the palace pharmacologist, and he's also listed as the priest and magician of the goddess Serket. Fascinatingly, Serket was the goddess of venomous creatures, so this implies he was connected to venom in some way, perhaps treating venomous bites. The tomb itself was sized to fit the prestige of the palace doctor. Typical of the Old Kingdom, it had an interior with funerary scenes, a painted false door, a red painted ceiling to resemble granite stones, engravings depicting furniture, funerary offerings, and of course, in the middle of it all, a sarcophagus. Hopefully, both archaeological missions to Saqqara are able to return next season to uncover more about one of the most important necropolises in the world. Heading north to the South Caucasus, a drone survey of a Georgian fortress reveals a hidden mega-fortress. The site is named Damanis's Gora. What's unique and particularly interesting about the discovery and study is how the team of Nathaniel Erb-Satullo and Dmitry Jakshviliani used drone mapping to create a nearly one-to-one digital replica of the site. Damanis's Gora is located in southern Georgia, not far from the Armenian border, in the transitional zone between the highlands and river gorges. It's at the point of a triangular plateau with gorges up to 60 feet deep on either side. Even before this most recent project, archaeologists knew there was a fortress, but could never have guessed how large it really was. The South Caucasus are an interesting area of the world that not only has a rough mountainous terrain, but was at the crossroads of civilizations for millennia. After a quasi-dark age, fortresses began popping up in the late Bronze Age about 1500 BC, through the Iron Age about 500 BCE. These thousands of hilltop fortresses are scattered stretching from southern Russia to Iran, Turkey, Azerbaijan, and of course, Georgia. This site was known at least as far back as 2018, when a team from Project Ark excavated in the center of the inner fortress. The inner fortress was clearly visible because there were 2 curved parallel fortification walls. Their excavation determined that there were 2 periods of occupation, the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age. This mirrors the fortress occupation patterns across sites around the region. The area of the inner fortress is 1.1 hectares, in other words 11,000 square meters. When they came back one autumn, when the grasses were much lower, they realized there were walls all around the area outside of the inner fortress that they'd been excavating. Do you understand exactly why they looked to the sky? They used a Phantom 4 RTK, a more professional version of this drone that has a 2-centimeter accuracy, to take over 11,000 photos of the surface of the site. Those photos then went into a software called Agisoft Metashape to perform photogrammetry. Photogrammetry is the process of taking many photos, aligning them, overlapping them to not just create one giant photo, called an orthophoto, but using the GPS and perspective to create a digital elevation map, in other words, a terrain map. With their 11,000 photos and 2 centimeter accuracy, they were able to get a digital replica with a 1 centimeter resolution. The largest feature is a 1 kilometer wall running north to south between the gorges, protecting the only reasonable entrance into the settlement. Mapping shows a few circular or semicircular structures along the wall, which could be buttresses. Throughout the area inside the outer wall are dozens of small structures that look to be buildings as part of the settlement. They also note that there may be some sort of tomb or burials around, but we're not able to excavate to learn more. The entire area of the settlement, everything from the outer wall to the edges at the gorges, measures 56 hectares. If it is true this whole area was actually a settlement, not just one distant wall surrounding an empty area, that would make this a comparatively massive city. For context, medieval Tbilisi was only 70 hectares, not that much larger than Damaniscora. Drone mapping the entire area worked particularly well here because the surface is pretty exposed and walls are visible easily, even if you just look at satellite images. But this could mean archaeologists have been completely underestimating the size and population of some of these mountain civilizations. P.S. For the amateur remote sensing archaeologists watching this, you can actually go and download the raw imagery and digital elevation maps they created and play around with it. Be warned, these are huge files. Link to that site in the video description. Moving further south, along the southern coast of the Caspian Sea is an excavated shipwreck that is a window into the golden age of Russian domination over this region. The Caspian Sea is the largest inland body of water in the world, and its coastlines often ebb and flow. As the sea level lowered near the modern town of Mazandaran, Iran, part of a 3-meter tall sand dune eroded away and revealed the wooden hull of a shipwreck. Called the Saqqara Shipwreck, a team from the International Association for Mediterranean and Oriental Studies in Italy and the Underwater Faculty in Tehran began excavating the ship to see the extent and what mysteries were inside. What they revealed was a wooden ship 28 meters long. They found parts of the hull, the mast, and even the cargo. Scientific analysis of the wood and cargo helped answer the big questions of how old was the ship, when was it wrecked, and where did the ship come from? Radiocarbon dating was the main tool to answer questions about its age. Using an accelerator mass spectrometry device resulted in the carbon-14 dates of the wood that made up the ship's structure. The radiocarbon technique dated this wood sometime between 1762 and 1808 CE. But there was also buckwheat in the cargo. Running that same radiocarbon analysis on the plants resulted in a date in the early 20th century, more than 100 years later. What does that mean? This is a prime example of what archaeologists call the old wood effect. Key to understanding is knowing that the radiocarbon dating measures the amount of carbon in the atmosphere only when the plant stopped growing. In other words, the date when it was cut down or harvested. Wood, of course, gets used for many years after it's cut down. Plants for eating, like vegetables and grains, are usually consumed within months or years after harvesting. This means the ship was likely built sometime at the end of the 18th or early 19th century but continued being used until the early 20th. That was despite the fact that the steam engine went into service in the mid-1800s and quickly became the preferred shipping method. The archaeobotanical analysis of this wood and this buckwheat answers where the ship came from. The wood was identified as a combination of Scots pine and spruce, a specific genus that comes from the Volga River Basin in Russia. The buckwheat in the cargo was also native to the Volga River Basin, suggesting it may have originated from the major Russian shipping port of Astrakhan on the Volga Delta. During the 1800s, when the ship was presumably operational, Russia had controlled the Caspian Sea. The Treaty of Gulistan in 1813 and the Treaty of Turkmenchai in 1828 between Russia and Persia gave Russia exclusive military access to the basin and de facto economic monopoly on commercial shipping. The excavation of the Saqqara shipwreck doesn't reveal why the ship went down, but we can imagine how this old ship was full of grain to import to Iran as it crashed ashore, getting buried by dunes for a century. For more science and archaeology, how climate scientists looked at the atmospheric history of our planet to understand the impact of Roman lead pollution. Previous studies from the Desert Research Institute had examined ice cores to identify lead isotopes over thousands of years. They most recently used this database to try to understand the relationship of the scientific dataset to the historical events of Rome. The team took ice coring samples from the Arctic. Using drills, they got columns that were 11,000 feet, or 3,300 meters, long. They used 3 of these cores and sampled the gas bubbles that were trapped in the atmosphere at various points in time. The study focused on the roughly 1,000-year period, 500 BC to 600 CE, that covers the entire history of Rome. Lead isotopes in the atmosphere help identify mining and smelting activities that would have been associated with Roman mines. With this, they were able to track the ebbs and flows of lead with the events of the Roman Empire. Lead peaked during the 2nd century BCE at the height of the Roman Republic. It declined in the following century with the Republic crisis, before increasing again in 15 BCE with the emergence of the Roman Empire. During the Antonine Plague of 165 CE, the amount of lead in the atmosphere declined and didn't reach those levels again until the following millennium. The reason that lead was so prevalent during Roman times was because of silver mining. The Romans mined the mineral galena and melted it down to get silver. Unfortunately, for every 0.1 ounce of silver in galena, there is 1,000 ounces of lead. Using data on the amount of lead in the atmosphere and modern studies on how lead affects intelligence and development, they estimate that this level of lead exposure resulted in a 2 to 3 point drop in IQ. That gives a tangible metric for the negative effects of Roman silver mining. As Nathan Chelman, one of the study's co-authors, says, an IQ reduction of 2 to 3 points doesn't sound like much, but when you apply that to essentially the entire European population, it's kind of a big deal. Finally, a bizarre and slightly humorous story. Why was a dog's penis bone from a Roman shaft painted red? That's the question that Dr. Ellen Green had. In 2015, an excavation of a Roman quarry took place in order to clear out the space for a new housing development in the village of Ewell in Surrey, England. Over 15 archaeologists worked very hard to completely excavate the series of Roman quarry pits and located a deep shaft filled with human and animal remains. This shaft turned out to be one of the largest of its kind. The excavation team from Pre-Construct Archaeology recorded and published their findings, but it wasn't until recently that Dr. Ellen Green looked further into what made the bones inside the shaft so interesting. The shaft in question was about 4 meters or 13 feet deep, split into 3 phases. The bottom 2 were the Roman remains and filled the lower 2 meters of the pit. A coin from 77 CE in the bottom of the pit indicates the shaft was used for about 50 years. The lowest level had the remains of 21 humans. The decomposition and arrangement of the bones suggests that some fully decomposed people were added to the pit while others were still whole. There were also 155 domestic animal remains in this layer. Above, phase 2 lacked any human remains altogether, but there were a similar number of animal bones, just slightly fewer that were fractured. Altogether, there were 280 animals in the shaft, 70% of which were dogs. The nature of dogs and dog bones here is fascinating. For one, the dogs all seem to be fairly small dogs, only 35 centimeters tall, like terriers and the such. Then, in phase 2, all of the dog skulls are missing. It is at such a level to not be accidental. Also, the dogs are extremely young. 25 to 35% of the canines were newborns or fetuses, and most were perinatal, meaning the dogs before they had given birth. This can't be accidental. Romano-British shafts like these, filled with human and animal bones, are not uncommon across the south of England and are often called ritual shafts. Typically, they are deep, like this one in Ewell, and full of somewhat sacrificial offerings. This tradition may be somehow related to the continent, as they are often closer to France. That brings us to the question of the penis bone. One of the most notable finds in the shaft was a red canine baculum. Baculum is a term for a penis bone. This bone, found in phase 2, had a unique red coloring. It was the only one of its kind found at Ewell or anywhere else in Britain. The team analyzed the surface with an X-ray fluorescence machine to get the chemical characteristics. The color was from an iron oxide, likely red ochre. Importantly, it was not natural. Also, the color was only on one side, the dorsal side of the baculum. It could have been painted or alternatively wrapped in a cloth, long since decayed, that was that color. Dr. Green proposes this was used as some sort of good luck charm. There was often a link between small dogs and fertility in Roman Britain. One example of this was a carved ivory knife from Hampshire showing 2 dogs mating, and was found in a pit with skeletons of 6 canines. Nearby Ewell, a Roman excavation of a grain storage pit, were the skeletons of 2 dogs poised mid-coitus, which fits that narrative. Not penis related, but Roman bones from other sites in Britain have hallucinogenics stuffed inside, showing that there is certainly something special about the bones. But why exactly was this dog penis bone painted red? It will take more excavations of Roman shafts to truly understand, but for now, we can just give archaeologists' favorite answer: ritual. That's it for this week's archaeology news. Thanks for watching, and let us know in the comments if there's anything we could do better, could be explained better, or any news we missed from this last week. Please make sure to subscribe, like the video, and turn on notifications so you don't miss out on next week's episode. See you next week.